Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. I don't know if anyone in this room remembers, but I did a show at Site Santa Fe almost 25 years ago when I was a very young artist. And so it's very nice to be back here again, especially with so many friends and people that I've known for a long time in the audience. And I think before I start, I also just wanted to thank everyone at Site Santa Fe and Luis Grachos, whom I've known, I think, for 35 years, is not with us tonight, but he is such an incredible leader in this institution. And I'm so grateful to everybody on the staff who has been installing for the last 4 weeks and working alongside me, and just grateful to have an institution that is small in its staff. I know everybody here, and that cares not just about art, but about artists. So I'm going to go ahead and start. For for the last 3 decades or so, my art practice has challenged the term landscape, that kind of ubiquitous but unexamined word that's so tightly wound up in how we are taught art history and the representation of places. My work seeks to radically reimagine how we speak about landscape, often through a very personal research process that feels more like trying to find myself within a given historical framework. How do we each habitually construct a narrative about who we are based on where we are? So I'm trying to look beyond the visible physical coordinates of a place to ask myself, where am I geographically, historically, economically, racially? What happened here? Where did the water go? Who did the labor of shaping this soil? Who has an emotional connection to this place? How does this place linger in the different realms of our individual, collective, and ancient imaginations? And so in this way, I'm expanding the definition of landscape to be less like this Frederick Church painting depicting the warped myth of the supposed American landscape, and framing landscape to include Standing Rock, the biggest native protest in history against the construction of the Dakota access pipeline, or Vieques, Puerto Rico, where in 1941 the US forced 10,000 people out of Vieques at gunpoint, and until 2003 used it as a military bombing range, dropping about 5 million pounds of explosive and heavy metals a year, you can do the math, continuously for over 60 years. Or one of the many mass graves on both sides of the US-Mexican border, or in Khan Yunis in Gaza, or the sites of India's mass cremations during COVID. All of this ground that holds changing meaning, as well as the urgency of the climate crisis and the migratory patterns of oppressed people, all of it is also for me what I mean when I say landscape. What we can't see when we look at what can't we see when we look at an image? In this painting by Church from the 1800s depicting Jamaica, what's not visible is that slavery in the United States had not yet been abolished, and that landscape painters, so-called traveler artists, were often commissioned by enslavers in the Caribbean to create picturesque views of their plantations. My expansive definition of what constitutes landscape ranges from the subterranean to the planetary, from the fiction of continents and national borders, to those more elusive, harder to qualify landscapes that we carry within the opacity of personal and ancestral histories. How can we hold the paradox of landscape as containing the memory of violent histories, as well as more numinous, empowering forms of intelligence? My work is rooted in the idea that landscape is more about what you don't see than what you do see. I wanted to start with some very early works to give a sense of how I first started to draw connections between ideas of looking, seeing, not seeing, and wayfinding. This is a sculpture titled Ink Mirror. It's made of high polished black fiberglass and marble. And I was inspired by my interest in this object called a cloud glass. A cloud glass was an early 19th century visual tool used by landscape painters who wanted to paint like the French landscape painter Claude Lorrain. It's essentially a black mirror, slightly convex, usually made of polished obsidian. It does not produce a true reflection, but rather catches the deepest tones and the brightest highlights, sort of like a really early version of a Photoshop filter. And the way it was used is that painters would go out into the landscape site and they would turn their backs to the subject that they were going to paint. And they would paint instead from the image in the glass. Oddly enough, it also started to be used by people who weren't painting, people making pilgrimages to famous sites or abbeys, who would use it almost as a way of viewing or containing the image, almost like a portable, temporary postcard, as absurd as that sounds. And what fascinated me about all of this was the idea of turning one's back to something in order to see it, which of course implied another, less obvious way of seeing. And this idea started to inform everything that I was doing. Where are my blind spots? What has been erased? How do you point to the invisible? In this way, anthropomorphizing the landscape so that while we look, this sense of place, of what we're looking at, is not passive. It also looks back at us in a reciprocal way, revealing much about what we've left out, what our own version of the narrative omits. This is the Seto Inland Sea, looking out from Naoshima Island in Japan. Someone just mentioned that they had just seen the piece that I have there. Naoshima is a place where I spent a lot of time thinking about islands in particular. And this is a night view of Blind Blue Landscape, which is a site-specific piece that I made there. It's on a 40-foot-long curved wall that faces windows that look out on that landscape. So this is the view outside the wall where the work is installed. And the piece is made of tens of thousands of different size glass cubes that are mirrored on one side. And the wall becomes this mirror to the outside view, essentially bringing the landscape indoors, but also distorting it and breaking it up and reflecting your own image superimposed onto the landscape. So an image of you looking at a landscape that's behind you, essentially. Each tiny cube becomes almost like a miniature landscape painting of the view behind you. And then the houses in this region of Japan, because I'm sort of always looking and working wherever I am. So while I'm installing this piece, I'm also in this town in Naoshima, walking around. And the houses in this part of Japan, in the Okayama region, are often burned with a traditional technique called shosugiban. And oddly enough, it's used as a way of keeping the buildings from catching fire. So you'll see a lot of use of charcoal later in my work and in the show that opens here soon. And on some of the buildings, the charcoal of the building is so shiny that it looks blue because it's actually reflecting the sky. And I became really intrigued with this experience of walking around the town that I started to see as almost like a dimensional charcoal drawing, leading me to think about the history of charcoal, the history of pencils and drawing utensils, and the thresholds between where a drawing utensil becomes a drawing and where it ceases to be thought of as matter, land, and physical place. So that led me to another work that I did. That thinking led me to Borrowdale, England, which is a rural area where graphite was first mined in the early 1500s and where the pencil industry started. So although graphite is found all over the world in lots of different forms, this was and remains the only deposit of graphite ever found in solid form. And so I started to imagine all of Borrowdale like one solid subterranean drawing or sculpture under my feet. And I started to make these relief sculptures/drawings that were made with solid graphite. And the ongoing series is called Nocturnal. The material is very dark and lustrous, and the image sort of emerges when the viewer moves and the relief surface catches the light. And I very much think of them as sculptures, almost everything I make. And I also started to make installations with solid chunks of graphite rock and drawing directly on the wall, like this series called Sfumato. This is a sculpture called Drawn Waters, Borrowdale, and I think of it as a drawing that's also a sculpture or a sculpture that has been drawn. To assemble the parts of this sculpture is to also build the graphite drawing, to draw in space. It's made entirely of solid graphite on a wooden armature. And Barrodale Drowned Waters is made with both solid graphite and raw graphite. So in many ways, it's a merging of pictorial representation, sculpture, and art made with the land itself, which is a theme that you'll see in a lot of the works that I'm making, or a kind of tactic, a kind of choice that I'm making in a lot of my pieces. This is a series that I made called Night Writing. And when I made it, I was thinking very much about the night sky as a legible surface. Human beings have always looked up for orientation. The stars are our first calendar, our first clock, our first map. So in the early 19th century, the French army wanted to create a system so that soldiers in the trenches could communicate at night, silently, without using light. And there was a captain in the French army named Charles Barbier who invented a code called Écriture Nocturne, which consists of, basically night writing, which consisted of a small piece of cardboard or hard paper with holes in it that corresponded to the phonetic sounds in French and the French language. And it was completely ineffective, and it never was used at all. You know, you can imagine, right? Picture it. But a few years later, he gave a talk at the National Institute for the Blind in Paris, which was, by the way, the first institute of its kind for people who are blind. And there was a teenager in the audience named Louis Braille who basically perfected the system so that each cipher could fit on your fingertip. So I'm kind of interested in this relationship between the tactile and the visual, especially in this particular work that I did. The idea of blindness in my work is less physical, less about your eyeball, and more about this idea of not seeing. And you can rephrase blindness in lots of different terms of varieties of not seeing: shadows, darkness, inaccessibility, denial, cloaking, peeking, squinting, hiding, camouflaging. These two are degrees of blindness, though less specific to the sort of physicality of your eye and more inextricably linked to thinking, dreaming, and imagining. So making these visual constructions in our mind's eyes, which is how it is often that we imagine or think of places. Again, like the cloud glass, in these works, something is revealed to you by seeing less, a different kind of vision. And it's no accident that in so many myths, the prophesier is also often blind, but has another kind of vision. In night writing, the visual, untouchable braille becomes absurdly illegible to both the blind and the sighted. The two languages are superimposed on one another and obliterate one another so that the meaning of every word is rendered mute. Words become invisible, so the ephemeral text is basically hiding in plain sight, and it does say something, becoming sort of the ultimate abstraction of looking and reading. And I don't like to talk too much about how things are made, because I think you have to sort of experience the materiality of works, but just so that you understand, these works are very sculptural. So it's handmade pulp paper that has holes blown through it while the pulp is wet. It's less about the image sitting on the surface and more about the sort of tangibility of this thing. There's a mirror placed behind the image as well. And it creates a very dynamic surface where the tiny mirrored constellation holes return the viewer's miniature reflection, and they're really small. They're like 1/4 of an inch in diameter, but you can see yourself in the surface if you get up close. This is a piece called Fata Morgana, and I did it I say a few years ago, but it's now almost 10 years ago that I did this piece in New York City, and I'm showing some older works here. I did it in Madison Square Park. And the title of Fata Morgana comes from a book by Breton that was illustrated by the Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam. And growing up in a Cuban exile community, I knew about Lam as a very small child, and I saw many books and prints by Lam way before I learned about Picasso in art school. In nature, a Fata Morgana is a superior mirage that's seen hovering over the horizon. And this recurring use of metal in my work, which is what this piece is made of, is both a reference to mining and the subterranean, as well as to light, sun, and the cosmos overhead. So a very expanded understanding of a vertically oriented plane describing place. And it's something that you'll see in a lot of pieces. The piece would reflect the image of whatever was happening around it. So I was interested, if it was spring, you could bed flowers. If it was winter, it would turn white. I was interested in how images, how mirages distort the landscape on such a grand scale. And I wanted to make a monumental sculpture that would distort and abstract its surroundings. About 60,000 people walk through this park. So it was also a kind of portrait of the urban commute. Things and passerby morphing into distorted shapes in the foliage cut out of the pattern reflected overhead. Oops, I don't know what that. Not unlike those Lam paintings of my childhood where humans merge with foliage. So this is Lam's Jungle from 1943, which some of you may have seen at MoMA. And of course, for anyone who doesn't know this, there are no jungles in Cuba. Lam was referring to a plantation. In my public art, the physical structure that I'm constructing is often happening at the same time as the social structure, quietly, sometimes invisibly being built alongside of it. One is used in service of the other. So that the work takes up public space physically, but the agentic contextualizing of the artwork is happening behind the scenes and being made visible through the programming and activation. In this case, all the programming was about erasure and visibility, everything in the piece being doubled, becoming doubly present. And so this is one example. I did a lot of programming under this while it was up. It was up for almost a year. But this is a collaboration titled Luminous Mischief that I did with the choreographer Stephen Petronio. And some of you may recall Stephen Petronio is Trisha Brown's first male dancer, and he's the guy that walked up the side of the Whitney, if that means anything to anybody. And so what we did is we had an open call to musicians and anyone who wanted to show up and dance with him. It was completely open to the public. It was not rehearsed. They just had to show up at a certain time, and much of it was spontaneous participation. I also did a series of bilingual English-Spanish poetry readings with many Latinx poets in particular, including, and I'm sort of giving you like very abbreviated versions of what happened. This was a very big event with lots of people who spoke for brevity's sake. So one of the people that I invited was Sandra Maria Esteves, who is known as, her nickname is the godmother of Nuyorican poetry. And here she is reading a poem about her own birth.
Half blue, feet first, she battled her way. The world did not want another brown, another slant-eyed olive Indian black child. Did not want another rainbow-empowered song added to repertoire in blue or azure or indigo or Caribbean crystal. Did not want another mouth to feed.
And then I did a collaboration as well with scholar of Afro-Cuban culture, Dr. Yesenia Celiet, who has since passed away, sadly. This was very specific. So to site specificity referring not just to space, the way we're used to talking about it, and location, but also time and contextualizing events as being a kind of site specificity. So it was 2016, just as President Obama had opened up relations with Cuba, which was a very loaded moment and pivotal moment. And so we recreated Dia de Reyes, which in colonial times in Cuba was the only day of the year that enslaved people could sing and perform in public spaces. Expanding the sense of what we mean when we use that mutable term public and when we say public art. The whole day was a day-long event, basically, that was, again, doubly present. Everything that happened in it was doubly present, as almost 1,000 people were reflected in the mirrors overhead. And what to the public looked like a festival or a show was actually a religious ceremony. So the private inserted or hidden within the visible notion of public and taking up double the space. In 2016, I started creating a body of work, and 2016, if we can all go back to that moment. But in 2016, I started to create a body of work that deals with that contentious term American, and who gets omitted from those definitions of place that stem from colonial conquest, often defined by the stealing, renaming, and reshaping of land beyond recognition. Fire America is a reference to how American violence is framed according to who is telling the story. It visually and strategically employs a reference to slash and burn techniques still used by many indigenous people in many parts of the world to shape and cultivate the land. So that the concept of America is depicted as burning and going up in flames, while simultaneously centering the productive generative language of slash and burn technique. Contrary to popular belief, the so-called Americas were not an untouched virgin wilderness paradise at the time of European invasion, but rather a human-made landscape that was carefully maintained and cultivated in elaborate ways by indigenous people who had kept it fertile and in balance for thousands of years. This notion, this myth, that the indigenous peoples of what we now habitually call the Americas floated changelessly through the millennia until 1492 is what we have been repeatedly conditioned to believe. Erasing the fact that Turtle Island was actually made up of a densely populated network of urban centers, many which far exceeded the size of London or Seville at the time. So this is a piece, and I've made many works like this, but this one in particular is a piece called Spectre, and it's all made of lumped charcoal and drawing directly on the wall. So the story of borders violently crossing people is also the story of land and water, and it's what's left when we take the scape off of the word landscape. I have reconfigured this work many times, depending on where I am, depending on where it's being shown and what the context is. Sometimes with the ghost image of Mexico scaled so large that it becomes the cosmos. Other times I've added a horizon punctuated by smoking islands that wrap around the gallery, like those burning archipelagic outposts strategically claimed for destructive military experiments, like Los Alamos, or like Bikini Atoll, or like Vieques, or like so many other places. And in this recent version acquired by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I've added all of the current US territories, AKA colonies, around the globe, where US empire is carefully hidden from view on small distant islands that don't even appear on maps in relation to the continent, but rather as an inset. And so I had to create this map because there is no map that shows all of this in one view. Charcoal is made out of burned trees, already part of a real landscape that I'm using to depict another imagined landscape, assembled as a puzzle that has never made much sense in jagged shaped states that refuse to consider the natural features of the land, where absurd geometric cutouts slip and burn like ruins, while also allowing us to point and to rectify narratives. This is a piece titled Autumn, Nothing Personal. And it was a public art project that I installed at Harvard. And the title, Autumn, Nothing Personal, is a reference to James. It was installed in autumn, in the fall semester. The title is a reference to James Baldwin's essay, Nothing Personal. Baldwin wrote Nothing Personal in 1964 at the height of the civil rights movement and published it in a book by the same title, which was a collaboration that he did with his high school friend, the photographer Richard Avedon. And the essay is accompanied by Avedon's images. It's a personal statement about an America full of loneliness, despair, and violence, and addresses the frustrated disillusionment of inequality, empty promises, and a country founded on lies. Baldwin exposes and criticizes American culture and the moral complacency of its people. Place, land, real estate is also always about power, ownership, agency, and control. This is a piece about visibility again, and I wanted to cite it precisely at the physical coordinates of so much power and visibility in Harvard's Tercentenary Theater, the most iconic and protected spot on campus. And by the way, Harvard is not public, so I say public art, but Harvard is privately owned. So it was not a public art project, and technically. I was very deliberately trying to create not just a physical, visually alluring structure where people would sit, gather, and linger, and sometimes protest. But again, this kind of social structure that's under the surface and less obvious. The entire project was presented as an opportunity for individual students and organizations, both on and off campus, to program, perform, debate, and to have a sort of exposed public reading of Baldwin's essay, which prompts a sense of public intimacy. Groups of dozens of readers at a time volunteered to read Nothing Personal aloud. And it was an entirely different experience than reading it in the quiet privacy of one's own mind, because it's heavy. I encourage everyone to read it. That particular semester, all incoming freshmen were assigned, it was assigned reading for them. And it was the semester that Harvard had the largest freshman class of students of color. It was also the first year that Malia Obama attended Harvard. So it was a particular moment in time. Ultimately, Autumn Nothing Personal is a piece about how we look at and engage with one another. And there were many, many programs that happened here, too many to show you tonight. But the project deliberately referred to the autumn light both in a conceptual and optical way. During the day, it felt like an immense sort of zoetrope, shimmering and flickering with reflections and shadows of the overhead elm trees, which are very protected, with people moving through it. And the elm trees are really interesting because it's not like they've always been there. So anytime one gets sick, they like replace it with one. So it always looks exactly the same, but none of them are original. I think they're from New Jersey. And there's a lot of manicuring that happens here, so it's a very interesting site. But at night, it has a very different quality as the sun sets. And it almost looks like a fire in the middle of the yard. So there were also dozens of collaborative programs developed over the 2 years that I spent in residence there that were shaped around this artwork. And so I had a lot of collaborators and a lot of partnerships that were built around this piece. And again, that invisible structure built around the visible structure. And one thing that I love about art in the quasi, in this case, public realm, is that it offers the ability to feel emotive connection in a monumental space. So for me, with any work that I show you, scale has always been about intimacy for me. This is a work titled Solarium Sanctuary. If you're down in Miami, it's right outside of Pam, and it's made of mirror-polished stainless steel. The immersive sculpture invites visitors to enter its optically shifting structure to see their distorted reflections within the woven formations. And the title fuses the words solarium, a sunroom with a view of the landscape, and sanctuary. And here I'm using it to refer very specifically to sanctuary cities throughout the United States that have offered protection for asylum seekers fleeing violence and civil wars in Central America since the 1980s. And so there's this sort of passive looking piece that actually has another thing that's containing it. This is Island Universe, which is a site-specific commission inside the newly renovated Ford Foundation. It was commissioned particularly for this atrium space. So you can see it from the street, and it's open to the public. Anyone can come into this garden atrium. And the sculpture's made entirely of this intricately handmade charcoal, a kind of sculpting with forms that get assembled together. And it spans a 30-foot wall and suggests the Earth's geological past, when distinct land masses formed one continuous supercontinent. And the piece is loosely based on Fuller's 1954 Dymaxion map. You may be familiar with Jasper John's version, also referring to Fuller's map, where the Earth's continents are depicted as one island in one ocean, with nearly contiguous land masses unfolding the Earth into a long string of shapes, like a carefully peeled orange that you can peel any which way. So there's no right way up. Island Universe challenges the north up superior, south down inferior presentation found in most world maps and asks viewers to question their conditioned cultural biases by rendering dominant reference points and cardinal directions meaningless. And by disorienting our coordinates, the piece prompts us to imagine and construct a new sense of the world around us. Here's a detail of an alternative way to visualize the Arctic Cap and Africa. And this is another piece that I made from that same series. It's called Twins Mirror Image from 2019, where I make a lot of maps, so these are all maps for me. I am depicting another reimagined map showing the interconnected and ancient relationship between the nesting shapes of South America and Africa and the Caribbean. Again, made of sculptural raw charcoal, it cartographically reimagines places that are usually seen through the lens of colonialism. And we have to remind ourselves that cartography itself is a colonial weapon, right? So it is a tool and a strategy. The land masses of this piece fit into one another like puzzle pieces because they were once actually one landmass. And as we zoom out from that Island Universe world map, I want to simultaneously zoom way in to the global centrality and immensity contained in those seemingly tiny Caribbean and South Pacific islands that I referred to earlier in passing. This is an installation made of 4 works from the Viñales series, a sculpture surrounded by these 3 glazed ceramic panels. So this is Viñales reclining nude. It plays with art history tropes of the figure in the landscape. And the piece specifically references Viñales, Cuba. Viñales is a rural valley. It's geologically the oldest part of the island. So it's a karstic landscape characterized by these kind of strange rock formations, and we call them mogotes in Spanish in Cuba. And the whole place is very sort of otherworldly and saturated in this glowing green color. And Viñales is also an iconic place in sort of the Cuban imagination, sort of like saying the Grand Canyon or something. So that even though from outside Cuba is somehow always visually represented as Havana in the 1950s and rarely seen as a prehistoric place or an ancient place or a colonized place made of indigenous and displaced diasporic peoples, or for that matter, a place with a very rich intellectual history. So the piece is made with malachite rocks from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which looked to me very much like the Viñales landscape itself. And sometimes they appear like these faraway aerial views of landscape, and other times you can kind of get up close into the piece and enter these cave-like crevices, which visually seem to expand and contract. And it's important to note that Viñales, the place, it has an extensive cave system used since prehistoric times by humans. In them, you can find petroglyphs made by Taino indigenous people before colonization. And the same caves were often the refuge for enslaved people who had escaped from surrounding plantations, who often formed small communes, hiding in them by day. And I also like to say this at this point in the lecture because I think sometimes we have a very US-centric version of historical events. So slavery in Cuba started about more than 100 years before that of the British colonies in the Americas. So Havana is founded with stolen labor of enslaved African peoples in 1519, not 1619. A lot happened. A lot of enslaved African people were in the Americas way before 1619. That only depicts the history of the British colonies, right? And so this lasted more than 2 decades after it was abolished, after slavery was abolished in the United States. So it's a much longer history of slavery. And the idea of this piece is what I often refer to in my work as stacked landscapes. The material is literally physically part of landscape, in this case, the Democratic Republic of Congo, used to describe or make an image of another landscape, viñales, and in the process connecting their relationship, affirming that we are always in more than one landscape simultaneously, depending on what we choose to look at. Later, I made a monumental mosaic version of this piece called Viñales, Mayombe, Mississippi. And this is at the New Orleans Museum of Art. It's about 50-something feet across. And the work cites New Orleans as the northernmost Caribbean city and frames New Orleans in its global context by drawing connections between scaled concentric geographies of continent, country, and city, weaving the historical relationships between Africa, Cuba, and New Orleans. The piece seeks to mark a public space that is both global and local, macro and micro, ancient and contemporary, immense and intimate, reminding us that if we look carefully enough, we see that, again, there's more than meets the eye. We are in lots of places all the time. Much of my work continues to focus on the liminal and expansive qualities of the Caribbean region, including many of the pieces that will be in the show that opens soon. This is titled Chorus, and it's a large floor piece sculpture made of graphite shells. It's a very quiet piece, and it's about the kind of portable sound of the sea and the idea of an object as a vessel that can contain place. And it questions the movable aspects of how place travels with us, rather than this sort of idea, that this construct of us always traveling to a physical site. I did, a few years ago, an exhibition titled Maelstrom in New York City that dealt with the enduring violence imposed on the people and the natural resources of the Caribbean. So this work is titled Caribbean Cosmos Earth. It's made of glazed ceramic. So up close, it's completely abstract as each tiny tessera becomes its own fractal place, revealing intimate little details, and then these immense sort of zoomed out omnipotent views that look both like galaxies or microscopic inner workings of the human body. What do all these islands mean? Often referred to in derogatory terms as third world or periphery or global south. These are invented terms with the primary goal of shaping our perception of the region as inferior. The Caribbean region is literally the place where our ideas of a global context get shaped, as well as our ideas of modernism. Columbus never set foot in what we now call the USA, United States of America, and the words Caribbean and cosmos prompt a view of the Caribbean as expansive, epic, again, intellectual, and defining, instead of just looking at it through the lens of smallness or through the lens of poverty created through colonization or cliches of resort paradise. This is a piece titled Rising Lynched Land. It's a sculpture that embodies the gravitas of violence while also evoking a very dignified metaphorical rising. It's made of scorched wood and copper, so I'm turning natural materials of vegetation and minerals into a suspended body that appears to ascend. And in Rising Lynched Land, there is no body represented, but the uprooted palm is suspended in this somber pose, slightly moving and sort of anthropomorphizing the devastated land. The piece in the back here is titled Archipelago Cervix, and it's a charcoal map made from the shapes of the over 700 Caribbean islands that have been reconfigured here and installed here as an installation surrounded by another series of small pieces from the Huracan series that relate to it. And the word huracan is a Taino indigenous word. It means the god of the storm. And this installation is about, very specifically about the systemic exploitation of women and their bodies, particular to the Caribbean region and the land. In 1953, the United States began using female names to identify hurricanes. So each little collage is named after a historic hurricane: Maria, Paloma, Nana, Katrina. And I'm making a pointed reference to both the use of women's names for catastrophic weather events and the history of violence in Puerto Rico against Puerto Rican women, who were unknowingly used to test and develop the birth control pill under the support of Margaret Sanger and the eugenics experiments that enabled mostly white women in the United States to go out and get jobs and control their reproductive choices. So between 1930 and 1970, 1/3 of Puerto Rican women were sterilized. That's 35%, as a legal US organized social improvement campaign. And not just there, but when they arrived in the US, many Caribbean immigrants were unknowingly sterilized in the 1970s, just like many Black, Indigenous, and Chicana women in the United States were. And I can personally attest that many women in my own family, my mom's generation and aunts who have firsthand experience and tell the story of this. There's also documentation, and there are documentaries that you can learn more about this. This is American history. And the practice is not just historical, but it continues today in many, many ICE detention centers. So these tiny drawings, which look like maps, but are much more like abstract little embryo shapes, they don't depict any physical land masses, are examples of the intimate and emotional component that is the guiding principle in my practice, regardless of I'm making something really big or if I'm making a tiny little drawing. And recently I've been making works by oxidizing patinas on copper. So this is a piece titled Kalunga, Copper Planet, in which a celestial copper body floats above the sea. And copper is historically connected alchemically to the planet Venus in many, many cultures around the world, which is associated, of course, with the feminine across countless ancient cosmologies. And the title references the Kalunga line, which is the watery threshold demarcating the lines between the spiritual and the physical worlds present in Afro-Cuban traditions and associated with the Atlantic Ocean. So the circle is highly polished and becomes like a looking glass, merging the viewer with the scene. It's made of two separate solid copper panels, so it creates a sculptural physical boundary of above and below. It's not just a picture, that water line. It's a physical demarcation. And these are some more intimately sized, they're like postcard size, oxidized copper works from the Kalunga series titled Maria Marea. They're made of 20 nocturnal seascapes that are installed in this continuous sort of cinematic horizon line. And the surface is in parts polished or eroded to reveal the copper underneath the chemical reactions. So there's a third component in their execution, which has nothing to do with me, which is the material itself and its rate of oxidation and reaction with the oxygen that almost blooms into these patinaed images. And I'm shaping what emerges in that process of oxidation with a big element of chance that involves the particular atmospheric conditions on the day that I make it, the amount of humidity in the air, et cetera, et cetera. I think of these pieces almost as psychic landscapes existing in the mind rather than as physical locations with precise coordinates or depictions of a particular place. And the title is a play on the words between marea, which is the Spanish word for tide, and the name Maria. And it is conceptually connected to the Huracan pieces that I just showed you as well. So the work implies the rise and fall of tides and its connection to the moon's pool and the understanding of the sea as feminine. This is a piece called Pendant, Lynched Land, and it depicts a battered palm tree. This frond sort of hanging ominously from a hemp rope. The sculpture is again made of charcoal, and the charcoal that I use is suggestive of the transformative and sometimes destructive act of burning. And I'm again trying to really invert that stereotypical use of tropical foliage as iconic of leisure and paradise to instead point to the devastation. This is a really big piece. It's called Manigua Mirror, and it conjures an image of a Caribbean landscape as a site of resistance. Manigua is a word used in Cuba, very particular in Cuba, to describe a dense forest or swamp, and used as a metaphor too in Cuban Spanish, to mean a chaotic entanglement or an impenetrable place. And it's inspired in part by that same Wayfinding painting that I showed you earlier, which has the group of figures merging into the jungle-like field of sugarcane as a meditation on the history and ongoing legacy of slavery and colonialism in Cuba. Again, this is charcoal and black sand, volcanic sand on a reflective metal surface. So here the viewer perceives their own hazy reflection moving and shimmering on that mirrored surface. So I'm interested in that returned gaze and what we do with it. And it's something that you'll see in a lot of my pieces wherever there's a mirror or a reflection. This is called Tether Lynchland. I just installed this at the Des Moines Art Center maybe a week ago. I can't remember because I'm I'm tired. But I think last week or the week before. And it also constellates around these ideas of iconic palm trees. And really kind of thinking of the burning as redemptive and transformative and like what ascends from the ashes of the act of burning. And then these are images from the show that I just had in New York, which closed. It was up in May. And the show was titled Soil Horizon. And in this exhibition, I wanted to turn to connect aspects of physical matter to how it is that the landscape lives inside of us, how it is that we carry landscapes inside of us, and what emerges when we contemplate our place through geological, cosmological, and sort of more existential lenses. So the words soil horizon are a geology term used to describe the horizontal layers that make up what we consider Earth, from the matrix of bedrock to the topmost layer of fertile soil. And these little ones, this is from a series of small pieces that I titled Bardo. And it's made from a cross-section slab of stone, different stones, tiger eye, jasper, where I'm filling in the absent matter above and below the natural stone material by casting the missing areas in plaster and rendering its subterranean characteristics with applications of these banded earth colors, earth tone colors. So each layer or horizon has its own unique material characteristics. And I mean, here you see that a lot, right? It's so exposed and visible how those strata work. But they're also like a portrait of a place. And each horizon line demarcates a chronology or life of the land whose soil profile it constitutes. And these are some of the wall sculptures also titled, some of these look like paintings. I don't make paintings. I actually don't think I've ever made a painting in my life. So these are all sculptures. They're made of, very specific materials that are connected to their conceptual framework. So these wall sculptures are also titled Soil Horizon, and they're made on solid copper panels. And the bottom is made from dimensional charcoal fragments to create this kind of solid ground that you see at the bottom of the piece. And as you go up, there are then layers of very crystalline black volcanic sand and red iron-rich sand from two separate continents, which merge and shift in composition so that their alternating horizontal striations slowly dissolve into these color shifts. And so it's a landscape made, like so much of my work, it's a landscape made with the landscape. And then above, there's this stippled layered effect that exposes the glow of the warm copper that's coming through from underneath. And in those areas, they're reflective, so you can see yourself mirrored in the work. And just thinking of, again, that more expansive idea of place and site, that includes almost like a spatial temporal quality, right? It can be also about the ancient and the historical, but also about the futuristic and celestial and the subterranean. And all of those things are encompassed in the verticality of those pieces. This piece, so what you're seeing here is a work that is made up of over 7,500 ceramic cubes, and each uniquely glazed cube is creating a kind of vibrating array of earthen textures formed by the chemical reactions that occur during kiln firing. And so the process mirrors on a really small scale the epic sort of geological processes of the Earth's formation. And the title of the piece is Sky Burial, which is the Tibetan tradition of very compassionately placing the deceased's body on the mountaintop to be consumed by birds and dispersed into the world in small fragments. It's always also thought of the most sustainable way to bury somebody. And I want to say something else about that piece, because in the Himalayas in Tibet, there's no tree line. The altitude is too high, and so they can't cremate their dead. And it's hard rock. There is no layer of soil, and so they can't bury their dead. So that's the reason for this. It's very much connected to the land. And so I was thinking with this piece about our bodies as matter, an extension of place, and really drawing attention to the ephemeral landscape of what we are. Soil horizon, I think, metaphorically for me, is also about what is buried, what's in transition, what's yet to emerge, which to me is sort of like past, present, future. And this contemplating of the ground, also emphasizing that living landscapes are conceptually stacked and in transition. So embodying not only what we see around us, but also all the subtle ways and accumulated layers of time, events, beings, matter that are always above and below, and often almost always obscured from the limits of our immediate primary perception. This in front of Sky Burial is a piece titled Sunrise Sunset, and it's a big sculpture made of cast concrete. And the title is a reference to the epitaph that compares the revolution of a person's life and death cycle with that of the sun's 24-hour passage. And it's this low to the ground plane piece that arches. So what's happening when you're around it is that it suggests a kind of circle or planetary body rising up from the floor. And the top of the sculpture has this exposed aggregate made of multicolored rocks and minerals. And the sides are polished, right, in this kind of cross-section to reveal that fluid strata of the poured concrete, again, recalling the horizons of the soil profile. And I wanted to end my talk today with my first film, which I just completed. I showed it last month, and it's also going to be in this show, so you'll get a chance to see it. I co-directed it with my dear friend, the artist, photographer, and filmmaker, Juan Carlos Salom. And here's our small film crew on site in the Viñales Valley in Cuba. And Viñales is Viñales is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the people in the film are friends. We have known them for a long time. They've lived in this rural community and cultivated and cared for this land for many generations. The film was shot on 16mm black and white film. But here you can see details of the red clay, which you don't see in the film. The views of the valley from inside the caves and the family's boyo. Boyo is the name for a hut or a home, which is an indigenous Taino word as well, that refers to that thatched part of the roof dwelling. And these are really ubiquitous throughout Cuba. In fact, if you study the history of landscape painting in Cuba and Cuban artists, there's always a boyo in it. So the film is titled Kwahani, and the word Kwahani it's a Taino word, but the specificity of it has been lost, and only local people use it use it to refer to this place. So you only know about it sort of if you're there. Nobody else refers to it as Guajani. They say Viñales, or Valle de la Penitencia. And so we move through this sort of primeval karst formation and in the film, and these dark caves and ephemeral mist. Guajani, as the film, presents landscape as a discrete living thing, body, one whose edges extend deep below the surface of the earth as well as high above it, in a holistic and multidimensional understanding of place that extends to the intimacy with which the land interacts with the members of the family rather than the way that they interact with the land. The work is characterized by these immersive sounds. So the film features the landscape itself as the protagonist. Guajani is the protagonist of the film, not the people that you see here. And I'm trying to invert this convention of the figure in the landscape. So here the landscape is the central character, watching the family that lives and moves through these physical elements. So it's like a breathing place, perceiving itself. So you have like the humans, the flora, and the fauna in this kind of meditative communion with one another, and a kind of shared consciousness with the land. And there are these diurnal and nocturnal sort of turnings of everyday life that unfold in the film. And I will just end this. This is the end of my lecture. And I will conclude by just saying that I'm deeply invested in my practice in bringing forth artworks that insist on being both fierce and subtle, personal and public, poetic and political, intimate and immense, and that prompt us to think about our physical and emotional coordinates in relation to both place and one another as a wayfinding practice. Thank you.
Water often figures in your work, either sometimes visually or the piece that had the quiet piece with the shells on that was installed on the floor. And I'm wondering how you see water and ocean as part of the landscape or separate from it in your practice, and whether you think about water in the film as well. In your recent show, there were sounds of water. So I'm just curious how water figures into your work as part of the landscape or as not part of it.
I mean, I don't think of it as different. So I think it's a really interesting question, because what your question reveals is that we separate the two, right? And so for shorthand, I might say landscape and everything that's included in it. But our way of thinking about water is a total colonial structure, which is about colonizing, right? And so in order to the history of geology in this country is connected to the arm of the US government that was surveying things and studying the geology in order to see how it could be used or colonized or extracted. It wasn't because rocks were cool and interesting and they wanted to see how the land worked. And so our ways of thinking about water are very much like that too. So we think of a river as a delineated fixed line, like on a map, or even when we look at something, right? We think of it as a fixed thing, as a fixed sort of shape of water. And I know sometimes it's hard to unlearn how we've thought about things, but in other parts of the world, water is not thought of that. And I guess before a certain time too, before we were sort of calcified into these ways of thinking about, right? So in order to call something a river or an ocean, you have to point to the edge that demarcates it, right? And that is about borders. It's about where one thing ends and the other starts. But there was a time where we really just thought of water, of like rivers and oceans as water, right? And water moves. And so if you see, out here, it's just so easy to see it too, because you have all these dry riverbeds and you have all these arroyos And so water just sort of like rises and falls and fills, and when there's a lot of it in one place, then we call it a river, right? But if you do this exercise, which I do all the time, right, which is instead of looking at a map of a river, go to Google Earth and zoom in on the same exact thing, and you'll see that it's not that shape, right? It looks more like the veins in our bodies. And so I guess I wouldn't make a distinction between the two, in the same way that I wouldn't make a distinction between where our bodies end and land or landscape starts. Yeah, and there's a really wonderful. I like Jane Hirschfield's poems, but there's this really great poem. I forgot the title of it, where she talks about eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and the whole poem is about where it ceases to be a peanut butter jelly sandwich and becomes her. Is it when she puts it in her mouth? Is it when she chews it and the enzymes, the salivary glands start to create enzymes? Is it when it's in her stomach? Is it when it's digested? Is it when she, like poops it out, right? So it's like, at what point does it stop being the peanut butter jelly sandwich and just become her? And it's a very, it's a really good example of how I think about everything, right? Or at what point do you want to draw the edge, right? And there's lots of places and lots of ways to draw the edge, which require a kind of, I think, responsibility, right? But also ask us to look a little deeper. I don't know if that answers your question, but okay, good. Happy to answer any other questions.
Hello. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture and talk. I'm just curious about the use of cube in some of your installations, and why you use cube while some others are, they seem flat, but they're not. As you said, they're all sculptures. But I'm interested in the cube.
The cube pieces, so the Naoshima piece in Japan. Well, I made those at a particular time, and I've actually just returned to them again in this last show, but in a completely different way. I think I'm laughing at like minimalism, honestly. I think that's why I started using them, is because it's a kind of language. It's almost like a blank canvas, right? But it's something that you're taught has a kind of authority within the framework of art history, right? And so if you take the cube and then you do something really sort of like funky on it, then it's sort of that thing, but it's not that thing. And yeah, I think that's the answer. And if you recall that one piece, Viñales Reclining Nude, with the sort of like trapezoidal bases and the malachite on the top that's supposed to be like this figure, but it isn't, right? There is no figure. It's very much sort of it's about other things. It's about all the really serious things that I mentioned, but it's also like a kind of looking at the language of art history, right? And modernist sculptures. And so if you look at those, they sort of look like they're like that, these trapezoid, but like nothing lines up. There's nothing perfect about them. And so I guess it's a little bit of a kind of inside joke in a way, right? But it's not about that. It's more that if I make something that shape, there is a legibility that you already bring to it. And that can make you stay longer and then sort of perceive what's off about it, right? So it's never actually trying to celebrate that thing or reproduce that thing. It has a kind of twist to it. Yeah.
Hello. Amazing lecture, and I'm very excited about your exhibit with Robert Smithson as well. I have two questions. I'll be brief. One is, what was your initial reaction when you found out you were going to be paired with Robert Smithson?
Oh, it's not like I won the lotto. I mean, I was very much part of the conversation. It wasn't like somebody just came to me and said, guess what, you won the show with Robert Smithson. So I think, so I've read, especially, I haven't seen many Smithson's works because nobody has, right? We have a very limited range of what we think of as Smithson, and most of us, for any artist of my generation, you learn about Smithson in school, and there's, the art historical the art history gardeners, whatever, and there's the one picture of Spiral Jetty that everybody has seen, right? And pretty much that's all anybody's ever seen. And so maybe a small piece in a museum, if you were in the right place at the right time and they had it up. But I've always been especially interested in Smithson's collected writings. And there are lots of aspects of Smithson's thinking, more than like works I had seen, that I thought were very interesting, and then some that I sort of, the older I got, was sort of critical of, and was like, what do you mean when you say that? What is this mirror reflecting exactly? Like, where are the people in your landscapes, right? Like, what happened to the people? And I think, Smithson is somebody who made art. He's very much a product of his time, right? He's a white guy in the 1970s who died when he was 35 years old. He's making art in a very particular moment in time. And I think that now we are having conversations around what we mean when we say land, whose land? Like, and so these sort of very neutral ways that art history frames like things like land art. It's like, what is land art? I mean, people were definitely making things with the land, way before the 1970s. And so I think that there's a kind of, a lot of like stars aligned. And I would say that Louis Gracho's was really instrumental in, we've known each other for a really long time, like for 30-something years, and he always knew that I was very curious and interested in Smithson's work, and so I was going to do a solo show here. He just invited me to do a solo show, and then he sort of came up with this, well, why don't we do it with Smithson? And the foundation was here, and then we started talking to Lisa Lefebvre, who is the director of the Holt Smithson Foundation, and so it happened very organically, but that's how it happened. It happened very organically and as a conversation, and the more we thought about this kind of crazy idea, the more it was much more exciting to think about, instead of doing a solo show, doing this exhibition that was a kind of conversation, an intergenerational conversation between my work, and there aren't that many pieces in the show of mine that are new pieces, so it's like an overview of, it's almost like a kind of retrospective of a lot of pieces that I've made, and many of the pieces that I showed tonight are in it. And so it was a really unique and exciting opportunity to rethink in constructively critical ways, right? In ways that, because I think that that's actually the great gift of it all, is that, artists who are no longer alive become very calcified when they're not looked at through subsequent generations and through living artists, right? And because the world has changed around Smithson. He's not just that picture in the book. And so I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and it is a real privilege to be working with people who are very devoted to having those constructive and expansive conversations.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Can I? Oh. About your studio practice, your body of work is incredibly ambitious. Do you have like a research team, and I mean, how does the magic happen? I guess if you can share a little bit.
I do not have a research team. I have myself, and honestly, my process, I do have assistants in the studio, especially when it comes to making, 8,000 little pieces of something. So a lot of like the making of small repetitive things, I absolutely have a really wonderful team of people who come and go depending on a particular project. And when I make public art projects that are very big, all of that happens outside of my studio, requires engineers and things like that. But the ideas are very, very much just me, and it is a very personal, intimate, and complex process that I could not even explain to you, because it is very much my inner world and my way of wayfinding, right? The research is not just research, it is me trying to figure out who I am and where I am, and that's what led to all of the pieces here. It's not like I'm, making it for some outside consumption. I am actively trying to figure out some of these things for myself. So I'm the research department. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Teresita.
Thank you.